TC Society. Today I want to do an instructional video on all things footwork related in regard to the form. So we're going to talk about a little bit about X-stepping, we're going to talk about alignment of the feet, we're going to talk about how the footwork applies to Tai Chi theory according to Wu Xing, the 13 concepts for Tai Chi, and a lot of other ideas. Everything that we present today, everything I'm talking about today, is going to be specific to TC's classic Yang style that I teach. There are some variations for other Yang style forms. We may talk about those at what level, I don't know. In the meantime, we're actually going to start with the alignment for the first posture. So we're going to start with a small square. So when we line up in Tai Chi harmony, we actually use the length of the foot as the basis for the small square because that's the side with here. And we can expand that square, making it slightly larger by allowing the feet to go up to 45. So if we're in the center, all the way out to 45 in this direction. And then from here, when we start, when we're opening the form, we step shoulder width wide. And this is a fairly standard measurement when we're practicing Yang style Tai Chi. This step, shoulder width wide, is the measurement of the shoulders here. If we look, this is where this tape is here. This width is measured. And so whether we use the inside of the square, whether we use the center of the foot for the alignment of the square, or whether we use the outside of the square, the inside of the foot, to have this kind of square step, that's depending on how deep we want to make the stance, how wide we want to make the stance. And so this basic square translates into a larger square, and this is what we do when we practice X-stepping. So we start from the center. We have this small square. We can imagine that it's placed in the center. I'm not going to add more tape to this area. But from the center, we step back, shoulder width wide. And it's also shoulder width deep as well. So these lines should be equal. You don't have to build this out with tape on your floor. You can if you like. For those of you that have practiced with me in the park, we've taken chalk and made something very similar to this. In the Mandarin, the Hanzu for rice looks like this. Sometimes in the martial arts, this is called the rice pattern, used for stepping exercises. So, if we talk about the square step when the feet are together, when the feet are touching, or the feet are aligned in this way, we have, it's the most balanced posture, but it's the least stable. We can stand here for a very long time. There's a lot of standing exercises. The basis of it, the feet are connected in a small square. The head tops up, whether we stand this way or stand in some other posture. But if there's some type of power, pressure that's coming from the side, not very stable. So we have to step to the corner. And so the compromise between balance and stability is movement. So if I'm starting from the center, if power comes and I'm moved, here I have a certain amount of balance and I have a certain amount of stability. The square becomes as large as you can step. So I can step all the way to the end of the other square this way and make for some type of very deep stance. For people that are wrestling, for wrestlers, like to have a very wide stance, a deep base, so that they can have a root so the other person cannot uproot them. And so we have a trade-off between balance and mobility. If I'm in the center and I'm balanced, it's very balanced but not very stable, but I can move freely in any direction simply by allowing my center to travel in the opposite direction or in a complementary direction of where the power is coming from. If I have a very, very deep stance, if I like to practice something that has this kind of wider stance, deeper stance, it's far more stable. It's more difficult to move my structure because it's here. it's also more difficult for me to move my structure as well, because I have to use some effort to change the size of that square to move it to a different size. So, what is the optimal? Sometimes in Tai Chi we use this balanced posture. And sometimes in Tai Chi we use the extended posture if we like to do a deeper type of stance or practice something. The compromise, the center between the two, is the square, the X step. So we have shoulder width wide and shoulder width deep. This is a very good geometry for practicing Tai Chi day to day. If you like to go to competition or you like to practice something more extreme, you can use the rectangle. You can use a much larger square. But for day-to-day use, while you're practicing, conditioning the legs, this is good enough. You don't have to step very wide, do a very deep stance to practice your Tai Chi. When you practice, you can simply use this as the basis. So, when we practice the form, we're also using the square to step. So, we open shoulder width wide, we have a commencement, and then when we start, we have what we're calling grasp the sparrow's tail. My foot steps along the 45, and then when I step forward, it's lined up with the square, and when I ward off, I realign my foot. And then when I change, this foot opens again along the 45. And when I step forward, we have a square for ward off, and we can realign the foot. This alignment of the feet in the beginning is challenging for people because their leg strength isn't enough to support their upper body. Remember, in the beginning, the first function is to straighten the upper body. And then we use this kind of X-stepping pattern. Once we have that upper body alignment, we want to be able to carry that upper body without disturbing its structure. And so we're going to have to condition the legs in sort of a different way. This X-stepping exercise helps us do that. So the alignment is important when we're practicing the Tai Chi form and stepping. Also, when we get to the next posture, after we have the second ward off, when we turn the feet in alignment with the grid. So as if it's turning from the hip. We don't want to just turn the foot, because that leaves my hip lined up this way. So as we turn the body, the hip and the foot turn. And we end up with this kind of corner, and we turn this way. So for rollback, after we ward off, aligning the feet accurately. Somebody said it's like a grid paper. If you can imagine on the ground, you don't have to see it. In some places, there's tiles, or there's hardwood floors that have lines. You can use those to help line up your feet. When we do the rollback, we end up in this pattern when we're facing the corner of the square. And this corner, if we look at this kind of step, in Shaolin we have a dragon stance or X stance. And Wing Chun, they have the same kind of step. And in Bagua, they're also using this corner step. So the Tai Chi form that we practice, we pass through this kind of step where our feet are aimed towards the corner, and then we realign to the square and we return. And this is all happening with the hips. We want to try to keep the hips level and aligned, turning evenly and accurately. And so the X-stepping helps us to coordinate the lower body, always keeping the feet lined up, whatever corner that we're stepping to. So, for martial arts, by the way, this is when we're practicing the Tai Chi form, it's more of a yoga, like a workout routine. It's a good way to condition the legs. For those of you that are into Kung Fu, into martial arts, you like boxing, that type of thing, nobody is facing their opponent with their legs open this way. But we still use the square. So, if I were to face my opponent this way, even if for something brush knee press, if this is my gate is open, right? For practicing a yoga where I want to condition my legs to be able to walk in a particular way, have leg strength to balance and do a whole bunch of different things, that's great. For the martial art, we use the square, but instead of facing this direction, if my opponent is straight ahead, I use this line and I turn the square this way. So if I use this square, my foot is this way, my foot is this way. But instead of facing forward, my angle is along that line. And so this is the same for Tai Chi. We use the same square step, but it becomes very narrow as opposed to being a very wide step. Why do we use this wide step? My teacher would say this: sometimes when people practicing Tai Chi, when they step forward, instead of being able to step straight along the line this way, they don't have the leg strength, or they don't have the balance, and so they're afraid. They don't have the structure to make this bracket with the hips and the leg, and so they're afraid to step forward, or they can't keep their center line forward when they step. And so what happens is they bring the foot in so that they feel more balanced and secure. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a way to practice Tai Chi where we have the narrow step, and whether we bring this in and keep it here before we step to the square, that's valid. But we should do it because we're practicing technique, not because we lose the balance or because we don't feel comfortable stepping in a straight line. When I'm teaching the form, a lot of times you'll hear me say the term square step. And that's because we may have a movement where when we're turning, this foot is lined up with the grid, but then this foot goes off of the grid because it's going to have a focus in the center of where the center of my power is. And then when we say square step, that means it returns back to the grid and it's lined up on the axis this way. And then when we turn, the same, my feet lined up here. So for martial art, we use the same square. And again, we can make that square much longer. If we're wrestling, we can sink it down. Let's talk about the Wuxing, the 5 elements. In Tai Chi, if you read the classics, if you read the old songs and poems, there's something called the 13 concepts, or 13 principles, 13 ideas of Tai Chi. And the first 8 are based off the I Ching, the 8 trigrams. So we have ward off, roll back, press, push, so on and so forth. Those 8 are the 8 powers of Tai Chi. The other elements that we're talking about are the 5 elements, and it's based on the footwork. So we can think of the 8 as being the upper body and the 5 as being the lower body. And so we're going to focus on that today because this is incorporated with what we're doing with the squares and the angles. So the first one we've already talked about is earth. We're in the center. Everything is balanced. It's not very stable, but very balanced, where power is coming. The same way earth is very balanced in its rotation, but if there's a large enough object, can knock it off of its balance. The same thing, if the wind blows, we can maintain our structure, but if some pressure or power comes, we may have to move. So the first one, earth, center. And then from there, if we do have to move, it changes. And so, because we have a Tai Chi theory, we have Ting, Hua, Na, Da. We have Hua, Na, Da as avoid, make contact, advance. Unless power is coming from behind and we have to avoid by moving forward, we always avoid first, and we avoid by moving away from where the difficulty is. So if power is coming from this direction, I step back here. If power is coming here, I step back. There's a number of factors involved. But stepping back to avoid along this grid, if I shift my center line to the back, here my center is in the center. When it's shifted to the rear, it doesn't matter which side, whether it's to the left side or to the right side. The element associated with it is wood. And so the feeling is, when we step back, it's very flexible. We have a strong root in the ground. We can put our weight over the rear foot and the upper body can remain very flexible. And so left side or right side, it doesn't really matter. And this can also be off of the square, but using the square in consideration. And it's defensive. So when the other person comes to attack, the more flexible, just like wood. If you have wood that's very old, it's brittle, it's very easily splintered. But when wood is young, it's very flexible. It's difficult to even cut, even with a very sharp blade. So we want to remain flexible. The opposite of that is the third element, and this is moving forward. So we have earth is the center. Wood is moving to the rear, which is defensive. But sometimes we have to move forward. So when we have to step forward, the element is metal. And the feeling is the same. The concept is that we're attacking. So just like we use the example for wood as being defensive, if we use metal, we can think of an axe in a tree. So if you're defending, you want the wood to be as soft, flexible, pliable, and absorbent as possible. But if you're attacking, you want the metal to be as firm, sharp, powerful, heavy as possible. So we've talked about three elements. Earth is in the center. Wood, very flexible. Metal, the same, whether it's left or right, it doesn't really matter, or sometimes straightforward along the line. Metal. The only two left in the elements, fire and water. We use the first one when we step to the side. This stepping to the side, fire and water, left and right, and one implies up and down. Fire travels very quickly up, and water travels very quickly down. So when we step to the side, we want to pour the weight in. And there's other times when we step and we have something going on, fire concept. So those are the five elements. Earth. We also see fire and water in cloud hands when we're stepping to the side this way. So earth is center. We see from the first posture before we do commencement. We see from the alsha, which is hook and whip. We may change this, and we may lift sometimes to demonstrate yin and yang. If I have my square, lifting one heel to demonstrate the difference between the 2 feet. Wood. Again, using the square step. We'll talk about, from the martial arts standpoint, the benefit of the square versus something more rectangular, and the trade-offs between the two. Forward, metal. We have the rear foot is supporting, power is moving forward. Water, fire, step, left and right, either way. We see that in the opening, we see that in cloud hands, and that certainly appears somewhere else. Before we talk about some other various steps, from a martial arts standpoint, why not use a rectangular step? Since we've talked about the square so much. In some Tai Chi schools, they recommend their students practicing what we might call gongbu. Some schools call it bow and arrow stance. Some schools call it mountain climbing stance. So this is a longer stance. You can see I'm using the rectangle and not the square. I'm stepping all the way forward, perhaps sinking back in this way. The reason is when you get into playing something like push hands, if you have to deal with one opponent or more opponents, the square becomes a more optimal foundation. You may have to make the square larger if you have to deal with more force. But the reason is because if I use a more rectangular stance, I'll use these two here. If I keep my stance this way, perhaps I can generate more power in this direction. The same if I use these lines. Perhaps I can push because I have a much larger triangle. But if power comes from the side, while I push here, it's more difficult to balance. So in a square, we have equal ability to resist front and back, left and right. So this is from martial arts if we're talking about push hands. There is an advantage. There may be a time when once you disturb your opponent's balance from your square step, where then you change. but only after you're certain that there's it's safe to do so. So, alignment. When we practice Tai Chi, one of the reasons I wanted to make this video is to be sure that you're keeping your feet aligned to the grid. If you keep your hips level, you can practice at home, you can practice the next time you do Tai Chi. Is try to keep the hips level and step to the square. You're going to have to shift. Activate your foot, relax your tailbone, step forward, grip the ground, and then sink the tailbone, the same, stepping forward, grip the ground. This is actually a very challenging step to do. And so, when we're practicing the Tai Chi this way, it's a way to condition the legs. You can also just use the X stepping routine. And so, as a reminder, what it is, if I face the other direction, when we start in the center, we step back to the rear left. And again, try to keep your feet in line with the grid every time that we step. So, the way to remember, we start to the rear left. Sometimes people in the beginning for X stepping, they don't know which corner. It's not really important, but there's some Tai Chi theory, especially when it comes to martial art, is if I'm standing here in the center and power is coming in this direction, if I step to the rear left, most people being right-handed going to punch in this way. Stepping rear left offers a different kind of space where the opponent is closed and we're open to them. So, stepping rear left, and then center. Some last ideas on geometry before we close. The first one is, if we take this shoulder width wide, and the feet are parallel, and we draw a line from your feet up to your shoulders, and then from your shoulders to your head top, you have the shape of an obelisk. So everybody's geometry is going to be a little bit different. We have different sized legs, and this is what is the idea behind it, is your Tai Chi will look different from everyone else's as well, depending on how long your arms are, how long your legs are. If we take that obelisk that we had just talked about, the shape where we have a triangle on top of the quadrangle here, and we step shoulder width deep. Now, if the tailbone is sitting in the right position, we have a type of triangle that comes up with a cap. And so this type of structure, again, is going to be the most stable. The people who built the pyramids used a square base. They wanted something that would last a very long time. They didn't use rectangle, they didn't use circle. We can talk about circle stepping. In some of the postures, when we have brush knee step, this form uses what we call Ao Bu. If you look at the Mandarin, there's the name of it is Ao Bu, which means twist step. And so, after we have a brush knee, this Ao Bu makes a sweep, and we want to get back to the square before we press. And then the same, when we get through here, this Ao Bu is sweeping around the opponent and pressing in this way. Again, there's other translations of brush knee press and other Yang style forms. In this one, we're using the foot to step behind the opponent and press through the center. The same way that we just talked about. This is all Tai Chi theory. If you want to be sure that you're doing Tai Chi in the correct way, and you like to condition the legs and strengthen the legs in a way that's going to allow you to do Tai Chi any way that you like, you can practice using this technique. But really, it's not necessary. As long as you understand these ideas, you can practice Tai Chi any way that you like. If your feet are open, this is your choice as long as it's lined up with your hips. From a martial arts standpoint, the feet being parallel in this way is sort of the maximum. If once they're open here, my power is scattered. The more that I turn them in, again, we get back to the triangle, this triangular shape. the more they're turned in, the more the power is focused in this way. Even if we have this triangle here, I use this square. I may even turn this foot in more to protect the center and deliver power effectively. Meanwhile, again, you can practice Tai Chi any way that you like. This is simply some ideas, some theory for alignment. I hope when you practice, if you practice X-stepping or whether you practice the form, you start to realize the focus of your feet. Turning from your hips, always protect your knees. The way that we do that, from the hip all the way to the foot. Line things up, change the weight, turning on each side. If you have questions, thoughts, comments, text me, call me, email me. Have a great day.